So today we're going to be talking about methodology for auditing, in this case, endpoint security products. The particular use case that we'll be referring to is Sysmon here, but really the methodology that we cover could absolutely be applied to any endpoint security product out there. So we're definitely not here today to pick on Sysmon per se. Some of the tradecraft and bypasses and evasions that we'll talk about will absolutely apply to other products. So my name is Matt Graber. I'm a security researcher at Spectre Ops. I've also been involved in a good amount of threat hunting work recently, which I really enjoy. Traditionally more offensively minded, but getting to apply that in a threat hunting scenario has been a ton of fun and has been really eye-opening and really serves to make me a better red teamer. So I also really enjoy burning tradecraft publicly. I would rather, nation-state adversaries not have complete control over tradecraft. Not to say that, ours is the caliber of nation states, but anything that we can get out there, we try to be as transparent as possible, which will include some of the tradecraft that we'll cover today.
My name is Lee Christensen. I am a security researcher and operator at Spectre Ops. So things that includes is red teaming, threat hunting, and I just do security research when I can. So I really like shiny security things, whatever it may be. That's why I hold no allegiance to the red or blue side. Just any fascinating security product that's out there, I like to go after. And some of you may be wondering why we're wearing these ridiculous outfits. Well, this is all for charity, and we have some big thank yous that we need to throw out for, we have Barry Blowdart on Twitter for kicking off the charity event, Dave Kennedy and Skip Duckwall for some major contributions, and of course, thanks to everybody who contributed to the charity drive. This is for MDA. We'll have a link at the end, but if any of you feel free to contribute to the charity. It's something that's dear to us and our team, so appreciate any donations.
Just so you know, this is like really awkward for us. Like we're not the types who usually like beg for attention, but we'll do as much as we can within reason to support a good cause.
So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to start off talking about the goals of an evasive adversary. We're going to present a typical detection methodology, and then we're going to present the subverting detection methodology, dive into why we're targeting Sysmon. We're going to, since Sysmon is a data collector, we're going to talk about some subversion strategies for data collectors, then wrap up with some conclusions from our research. Goals of an evasive adversary. So ultimately, the goal of an evasive adversary is to avoid detection at an organizational level. So if AV catches something and it's not forwarded to the back end to where the SOC can analyze it, that means detection has failed because the adversary is going undetected from an organizational level. This can be accomplished by blending in with normal, by exploiting defender biases when they're writing detection rules, and in general, just avoiding human eyes altogether. So if we can subvert the detection tools or data sources, then we will be successful as an evasive adversary.
So ultimately, subverting security solutions really is just an engineering challenge of more mature adversaries. So as a red teamer of a sufficient maturity level, you really should be trying to emulate that. So I know some vendors will certainly be sensitive about researchers showing off bypasses for their specific product. We're more about showing general evasive techniques that can apply to one or many security products. So if the adversaries are doing that, then if we want to deliver value to our customers or any defenders out there as well, or if a red teamer wants to provide as much value as possible, then they should be doing these same things and identifying the key terrain in their target environment and having evasions prepared.
So like we said, ultimately an organization wants to be able to detect detect attacker activity inside of their network. So what goes into building out a detection? Because that's going to influence us if we're trying to subvert it. So a generalized adversary detection methodology is you identify an attack technique. So this could be a specific lateral movement technique or privilege escalation technique. You find a data source that may inform you, or that may provide data about when that technique occurs. So that could be like when a process is created. It could come from something like an ETW provider. Then you have to actually have a tool that will do this collection. So in this, Sysmon fits this case. It is a data collection tool. So we're going to apply a strategy to subverting that data collection tool.
And I did just want to highlight that Sysmon is not, we wouldn't consider it to be like a full-fledged endpoint security product. It really is just a data collector that can be used to supplement existing or additional data sources.
Yeah. And that brings us right into the next step of the detection methodology, which is transport. So this can take place within an endpoint solution itself, or the transport of events from an endpoint to a back-end analysis system like a SIM. And then there's enrichment and analysis that goes on with any events that are transported. And then there's some sort of classification, whether it's malicious, suspicious, or benign. And then, of course, if it is malicious or maybe suspicious, there's going to be some sort of alert. Maybe there's a blocking action as a response. This could also occur, like with antivirus. If there's an alert, it may write it to an event log, and then that event log will be transported, hopefully, eventually back to the back-end SIM. So just as we have these 7 steps for a detection methodology, those exact same steps inform our subversion methodology. So essentially, the detection subversion methodology is evading or tampering with any of the steps of the detection methodology. So instead of, as a converse to the first step, an attacker can select specific techniques that the target organization may not be aware of. They may subvert data sources, so they could disable a specific ETW provider if that's being used to generate the data. They could subvert the data collection tool, so suspending the tool or killing off the process.
And ETW is kind of all the rage with a lot of specific vendors out there.
Mm-hmm. And then an attacker may also take the approach of subverting the transport of that data, so disabling a log forwarder. The classification engine, say there's a specific signature, so AV is a classic example of this. It's very much signature-based, so we just have to bypass the signature. And that's the component. We're attacking the classification component there, and then alerting and response. So can we somehow prevent an alert from ever being sent off to the SOC to be analyzed? So we could disable a log forwarder if that's what they're using to essentially ship off that, or we could use a firewall to block any communication of the endpoint to back-end alerting systems.
So it sounds like what you're referring to is like a macro and a micro evasion strategy, yeah?
Yep, exactly. So you have, at a micro level, you have what's occurring on an endpoint or some other part of the network. But if detection occurs there, the overall goal of the organization at identifying that there's an attacker is not complete. So the endpoint alerting has occurred, but somehow that alert needs to also be transported to the back end so that the SOC and the security team at an organizational level becomes aware of the detection as well. So you can subvert it at the micro level on the endpoint, so you can subvert detection there. And if you can also subvert detection at the macro level of preventing the SOC or the organization from knowing about the alert, then you are successful as an attacker.
So we found that categorizing the holistic evasion methodology as such, or the detection methodology as such, is, although while each of these events may seem obvious and intuitive, we tend to like to have them written out because each category will have separate evasion strategies and tactics involved in each one of them. So what was our rationale for targeting Sysmon specifically? Again, defenders use it heavily. I know of some vendors that actually take dependencies on it, some of which those products we've run into in enterprises. So again, we're not here to pick on Sysmon per se. We actually have a lot of nice things to say. And some of the tradecraft that we'll cover bypasses not only, or evades and bypasses not only Sysmon, but is likely to evade other products as well.
So we're going to specifically focus on data collector subversion strategies. Like we mentioned, Sysmon is a data collector, so that fits in right with step 3 in the detection methodology. So we're going to apply some strategies that we've come up with to subvert data collectors. Our interest as attackers is tampering, evasion opportunities, and any part of the attack surface that we could take advantage of. So if there's any vulnerabilities. In our experience, most vendors tend to focus on the attack surface analysis, maybe pay attention to the tampering part of it, but very few are paying attention to or putting a lot of research into the evasion aspect of things as well.
They acknowledge the TAVIS threat.
Yes. So again, we're going to focus on the data collector since Sysmon is that. The strategies we will be talking about are, number 1, familiarization and scoping of your research, data source resilience auditing, footprint and attack surface analysis, data collection implementation analysis, and the configuration of the tool. So that type of analysis. So step number 1, tool familiarization and scoping. A big part of this is just understanding what the purpose of the tool is and understanding the guarantees. So what do we mean by guarantees? This is tampering guarantees, under which circumstances can an attacker or does a product protect against an attacker, and also the collection guarantees of that tool. So what events does the tool claim that it is collecting? And does it do so correctly? And then understanding the threat models. So kind of going along with that tampering guarantee, what type of attacker is the tool secure against? So is this a low privilege attacker? Is it an administrator? Is it somebody in the kernel? Which aspect of attack or what type of attacker does the product protect against? And in general, just getting comfortable with the tool. So just installing it, configuring it, using it, seeing how it's used from inside of an organization. So Sysmon, taking the same approach. Sysmon is a user mode activity sensor. So it's not going to be monitoring things inside of the kernel. That's not its purpose. It functions as a standalone executable and driver. That's how it implements these components. There isn't any sort of centralized deployment and configuration management. Most organizations are going to end up deploying it through some third-party tool. It could be SCCM, could be GPO, name your favorite tool. There are, like Matt mentioned, there's no analysis capabilities inside of Sysmon. It's a data collector. You write data collection rules. Analysis takes place with your detection rules inside of something like a SIM.
Notice that Lee mentioned data collection rules versus detection rules. That's an important distinction, I think.
And again, the guarantees of Sysmon is that it's resistant against a non-administrator. So once an attacker becomes admin, all other protections that it has in place are no longer guaranteed. In addition, those data sources from which Sysmon pulls events, it has guarantees that it is comprehensively collecting those unless there are filtering rules in place. So this is important because back-end SOC analysts are assuming that everything that Sysmon is reporting is the whole picture, that nothing is being filtered and that it's comprehensive. So that's the guarantee that Sysmon is making unless there's filtering rules in place.
So data source resilience auditing, this is a critical step that we would take when assessing a new product, in this case Sysmon. So the questions that we would ask ourselves are, 1, what events and event fields does this product capture? And of those event fields and event types that exist, what of those can be directly or indirectly influenced by an evasive attacker? And finally, what fields do defenders typically use when building collection rules? Because armed with that knowledge, we can exploit naive detection or rule creation methodology that your typical defender might have. So first, we would look at whether or not there are generic rule evasions. So we'd have to identify what can be logged and what attributes of the event can be influenced. So Sysmon supports all of the following event types. So you actually have some pretty good coverage, and it is pretty understandable why defenders really like Sysmon, because it really is an outstanding supplementary source of event data. So I'm going to go through a more detailed example covering process create in just a moment. But our methodology would be looking through each of these event types. For example, we'll cover WMI events soon, and we have a new generic WMI event evasion such that it would never be logged in the first place. For things that are not directly under our control, we could fall back to either influencing what fields can be modified by us, or exploit the rule engine itself. So if we get access to a configuration, we can build an evasion strategy that is specific to that configuration. So one thing I wanted to mention was, for example, the image load event type. One of the fields that it captures is signature-related information. For a long time, and maybe up until now, a lot of defenders still assume that it is a non-trivial process or not even possible to evade signature analysis, whereby you'd have something indicating that a signature is valid and say that it is signed by Microsoft. So both of those aspects of code signing can be completely subverted. And there's various types of attacks. I have a white paper that covers one such class of attacks where signature analysis can be completely evaded. So I just want to mention that. Well, let's dive into process create events specifically. Now, this diagram that I have here, just be mindful it's extremely subjective. The column on the left in the green is are the fields that are directly influenceable by an attacker. Now, the reason it's subjective is because, this could certainly depend on your initial point of entry, whether you came from an exploit, a macro, where post-exploitation factors might not be directly influenceable. This was developed more from the perspective of a true post-exploitation scenario. So the column in the middle could potentially be influenced by an attacker, and then the red ones, generally speaking, you don't have much control, if at all, over any of those. Now, I didn't just blindly accept that those in the red would not be directly influenceable. For example, there was a time when I didn't understand how the process GUID was actually built until I reversed the Sysmon service and learned that it is actually comprised of the machine GUID, which can be retrieved from the registry. So if you wanted to tamper with that, you'd have to be admin, the time of process start, and also the token ID. So I had to understand how it was derived so that I could be confident that I was actually placing it in the red category instead of making assumptions, because it's those naive assumptions that we as evasive attackers are trying to take advantage of. So this is kind of what our goal is when we are auditing configurations specifically. So we want to go from landing in our target environment where we're shrouded by the fog of war. And so by the fog of war, the analogy would be we haven't obtained the security configurations in that environment yet. Our goal, ideally, is to obtain that configuration, ideally without getting caught. So in that time frame between obtaining situational awareness and ideally not getting caught, that is inherently a much more high-risk environment where we're going to have to prioritize using tradecraft such as, for example, like the generic WIMI evasions, really any generic evasion, such that the data source would not even enter or be logged by Sysmon. So we need to be mindful of that. The ultimate goal is obtaining the specific configuration for that environment. So in Sysmon, you would do sysmon.exe-c. Now, -c provides a nice way to parse out the rules blob, which is contained within the registry. Considering we also consider attack surface analysis of Sysmon, I didn't dive into it too much, but I did really need to understand how the binary rules blob in the registry was formed. So I did write a parser for that. It's a PowerShell module called PS-Sysmon tools. So I use that a lot, and it offers an alternative way to recover and parse a binary Sysmon configuration.
So the third step is the third strategy is data collection and implementation analysis. So this entails understanding what the data sources are for the collection tool. So that could be an ETW provider, it could be a kernel driver, a mini filter driver that's queuing up events. And then also understanding how do defenders actually use those event fields when they're building out their detection rules. And then also understanding is the tool makes a claim and a supposed guarantee that it collects all of the data for a field or for a specific event. We need to verify that that collection is correct.
All right, so let's talk about the WIMI event in Sysmon. So our goal is to identify a technique such that WIMI persistence would never be logged in the first place. So we're not talking about evasion in this case. Ideally, we want to tamper with or just bypass the ability for Sysmon to collect that data in the first place. So our strategy is pretty simple. We just have to figure out how WIMI persistence is actually being achieved within the code. So this actually didn't require a ton of reverse engineering. In this case, I literally just ran strings on Sysmon and saw that the implementation of WIMI persistence is as follows. So this is a WMI query language query, or WQL for short. Now, when you register WQL event queries, they are going to be specific to WMI namespace. So there's a ton of WMI classes, and they're all organized and stored in different namespaces. So the reason that this is specific to the root subscription namespace is because, well, that is the most common namespace in which the three components of WMI persistence, and that's event filters, event consumers, and filter to consumer bindings would live in. So let's parse this out a little bit. So select star, so that refers to give me all properties from an instance operation event, and that is the superclass of an instance creation, instance modification, and instance deletion event. So this is casting a relatively wide net on WMI persistence on whether you're basically creating or modifying existing, like in the case of modification, modifying existing legitimate WMI persistence, where the target instance is of what WMI class type? Event consumer. So a consumer is where you insert code. So that could be a command line event consumer, so execute PowerShell.exe, whatever. It could be an active script event consumer, where you're executing inline Windows script host code, like VBScript or JScript. Or the target instance is an event filter. An event filter defines the event that you want to trigger on in the form of something like this, a WQL event query. Or it's a filter to consumer binding. This is the thing that binds the filter and consumer together and actually registers the WMI persistence. So I know from previous experience that it's not just the root subscription namespace that these WMI persistence artifacts actually live in. They also live in the root default namespace. So Microsoft, the developers of Sysmon, just happened to neglect this one. Fortunately, that will be a really easy fix for them to implement. They would just put this same event query and bind it to the root default namespace. Auto runs has a WMI persistence tab, and it already captures root subscription and root default based persistence. So I wouldn't be extremely satisfied with doing WMI persistence on an op using the root default namespace. Well, one, because I'm kind of burning it right here, and because it's easy to fix. So that may not last forever. So can we do better? So while on our team, we like to come up with evasive tradecraft, eventually release it for others to build detections off of. But we're always asking ourselves, like, can we do better? So when this technique eventually is burnt and there are mitigations and or security optics for it, we still need to be thinking of the latest and greatest things so that we can try to win, always be winning the cat and mouse game. And that's all this is. It's just a constant cat and mouse game. So I wanted to know if WMI persistence was possible outside of the existing known WMI namespaces. So I was reading some documentation, and this one came up. And it turns out that every namespace in WMI is automatically populated with system classes. So a system class is any class that starts with underscore underscore, 3 of which are event filter, event consumer, and filter to consumer binding. Now, what you don't get are the standard Microsoft event consumers, which would be like ActiveScript event consumer, command line event consumer, and various others. So that's a problem, that we don't have those exposed to us in a non-standard namespace. So what do we do? And just to call out what the goal is here is I would like to perform WMI persistence in any arbitrary namespace, if possible, because traditional WMI detections up to this point are focused on namespaces. So if any namespace could be used, then we're going to need to do better with our detection somehow. So we need to figure out how to implement different event consumer classes. So ideally, I'd love to replicate the ActiveScript event consumer or command line event consumer in my namespace of choice. So I had to understand the implementation of ActiveScript event consumers in this case. And so where I would start is by looking at a MOF file or a manage object format file. This defines kind of like the schema of WMI classes, methods, properties, and it also gives you some information about how they're registered. So here's the definition for ActiveScript event consumer. And what happens next is the consumer is bound to a provider. So in WMI, there's a ton of classes which represent data that can be collected, set, or methods that can be executed. But under the hood, there needs to be code that can either supply classes with information or execute methods. And so the code that supplies WMI with its functionality is a provider. And these are all registered as COM components, these providers. And so I saw this, and note the CLS ID there, the one that starts with 266. And what happens is the class is bound to that provider. And then the provider itself is registered for that specific namespace. Now, just to show you what that particular provider points to in the registry, for ActiveScript event consumer, the backing provider is scrcons.exe. This is the component that actually executes the VB script or JScript when ActiveScript event consumer is used. So our weaponization strategy is as follows. We want to enable an ActiveScript event consumer or command line event consumer for any arbitrary namespace. And so I was able to achieve this, and you can go to this link. I'll make it a public gist after this talk. And I implemented 2 PowerShell functions. And I'll show off the new ActiveScript event consumer class. So what this does under the hood is it creates an ActiveScript event consumer class using the class name of your choosing. So it doesn't have to actually be named ActiveScript event consumer, and it will live in any arbitrary namespace you want. So it's going to bypass all of the classic WMI-based detections for persistence. So let's dive into a demo here. All right, so I've got PowerShell up and running. And what we're going to do first is just clear out our Sysmon and WIMI operational event logs. I don't want it to be overly populated. Now, I want to show you the currently running Sysmon config, and all I'm capturing right now are WIMI events. Now, these 3 WIMI events refer to detections for the creation or modification or deletion of event consumer instances, event filter instances, and filter to consumer binding instances. Now, I'm going to load the code that implements new ActiveScript event consumer, create my class, and notice that the namespace I specified is foo. So this is going to live in the root foo namespace. And the class is actually called not an ActiveScript event consumer, just to show you that you can name it whatever you want. So confirmed that that was created in the root foo namespace. Now we're going to create a file that our little payload is going to write to. So here's a little VB script payload that we're going to run. It's just going to show the date time. It's going to execute every 5 seconds using an interval timer instruction, or interval timer class. Select star from timer event where timer ID equals our timer. So the event will trigger every 5 seconds. And then we're going to register our event consumer. In this case, our not an ActiveScript event consumer class in the foo namespace. And finally, register everything using a filter to consumer binding. So let's run that, get our persistence going in the non-standard namespace. And if everything works out, every 5 seconds, we should see our payload executing as system. So nothing terribly special about what you're seeing. This is still your classic WMI persistence. The difference being it lives in an arbitrary namespace using an arbitrary class name. Now, just to prove that that Sysmon does not capture it, event ID 21 refers to creation, modification, or deletion of filter to consumer binding instances. So we don't have an event for that. If this lived in root subscription, it would have captured it. But fortunately, starting in Windows 10, we have a mitigating detection, which I think is amazing. In the Microsoft Windows WMI activity operational event log, we get the full context of that persistence. So this is a great way to highlight that Sysmon is very much a supplemental data collection tool. So there will always be other better supplementary event log sources. In this case, if you're in a Windows 10 environment, then you get this one. So this captures the namespace context, the name of the event consumer, the class name of the event consumer, and all of the context related to its registration.
So bringing this back, this is all important. This was an important part of the methodology. We're verifying that the data collection tool, it said it had a guarantee that it collected WMI event subscriptions, and in this case, we verified that that was not quite the case. So highlighting the importance of actually taking that, doing that step in the methodology. The next step that we're going to do, that we performed as part of this, was the footprint and an attack surface analysis of Sysmon. So our goal in this is trying to understand what Sysmon adds to the host, so what files, drivers, et cetera. How does the tool behave during operation, so that's during installation, during its normal use cases, when the configuration is updated, et cetera. And then what resources does the tool depend on? So building out a dependency tree to identify if there are any technologies that that Sysmon depends on that we could potentially attack. If we can attack those dependent technologies, then we can potentially subvert Sysmon itself. So we're going to just focus on one aspect of this just due to time constraints, but we're going to talk about Sysmon's installation. So Sysmon, like I mentioned, does not have a centralized way to update or install itself. So typically that's either done on a golden image or more often pushed out through an IT administration tool. So for example, GPO, it could be installed through there. The installation behavior changes depending on which Sysmon binary is used. So when you download Sysmon, there's two executables. There's sysmon.exe and sysmon64.exe. A lot of people just end up using sysmon.exe because when you run it, it actually extracts the 64-bit version. So sysmon.exe is the x86 version. And when you run that on a 64-bit system, it'll extract the 64-bit version and execute that instead. So once some of the interesting things that we noticed that it installed on a machine was there's various files that it adds. So sysmon.exe and the driver. That's a service, the Sysmon service, the user mode service, and the driver component, which does a lot of the collection. There's the services for Sysmon and the driver. There's all the registry keys associated with the service and the driver. One worth standing out is the parameters registry key, the third one down. That is where the Sysmon configuration file is stored. And as Matt mentioned, it is only accessible by administrators. Non-privileged or unprivileged users on a machine cannot access that.
Which is fantastic that is locked down like that, because other things that I think should be locked down, which always aren't, would be like event logs. Like the PowerShell event log, for example. Any non-admin user can read that to their heart's content and pull all kinds of interesting information for their situational awareness.
Likewise, Sysmon installs an ETW provider from which it reads its events, and then it has an event log that we can also view and access the events from. So again, the reason why we want to understand what these are, because if I as an attacker can gain control of any of these components, then I can potentially subvert Sysmon as a whole.
And each one of those bullets is a securable object, meaning each one of them will have a security descriptor associated with them. So that would be part of our analysis, is ensuring that, yes, you indeed have to be admin for each one of those components.
And we did verify that for these specific components that you do have to be an administrator. As I was doing this analysis, we did realize a few interesting things. So if you are using the 32-bit Sysmon on a 64-bit system, it auto extracts the 64-bit version of Sysmon to the temp folder. Usually, IT administration software is running as system, so when this happens, the installer gets written to the C drive Windows temp folder, which is writable by everybody on the operating system. So as you can see here in this procmon image, this is during the installer. We can see Sysmon. It starts off, the x86 version is in System32 Sysmon, sysmon.exe. After that runs, it extracts the 64-bit version to the temp folder. So and then it executes it. So from an attacker perspective, I have a couple different ways I could abuse this. A very simple one is through DLL hijacking. I can just drop a DLL that Sysmon is looking for, and I did verify that there are several. And then you can, potentially elevate your privileges to system. You can also use symlink redirection there's a time of check and a time of use type of attack that you can do there. That's beyond the scope of this talk.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, big thanks to James Forshaw for that research. In addition to just the installer file itself, when Sysmon is installed, it uses winEventUtil.exe to install the event log. And how it does this is during installation, it copies a XML manifest to the temp folder. And exploitation of this takes a little bit of little finesse. So as you can see in this screenshot here, the highlighted items show where that file is added. So the first highlighted item at the end, you can see it's dropping it to C Windows temp, and then it's called man, and then 4numbers.temp. So that's going to, Sysmon attempts to find a non-existent file, and it uses that same format. So man, 4numbers, then .tmp. So I had the idea of, well, what if I just exhaust that name, that character set? So those numbers are always going to be, alphanumeric. So if I add, that's going to be 36 potential characters, 36 to the fourth because there's 4 characters. So I wrote 65,535 files to the temp folder and then removed write access to them so Sysmon could not write to them. And when that happened, an interesting behavior occurred. It always created the file created the file man1.tmp. So at that point, I had a predictable location to where Sysmon was always writing its file, and I could potentially use the James's symlink attack to gain control over the event manifest. So this is interesting because during the installation, it uninstalls the existing event log, and then it will reinstall it. So using this, I could potentially uninstall any event log on the system or abuse that XML file in a bunch of other ways.
So what Lee just covered, maybe not the sexiest form of privilege escalation, but it's definitely one of those like lie-in-wait vectors. But considering, administrators are eventually going to update Sysmon to a later version, as long as you're already embedded and you can lie in wait in C Windows temp, then you'll be good eventually. Another part of attack surface analysis and really just knowing like what is the overall footprint of any security product would be if there is a driver component, the communication mechanism or the interface between the service and driver. So the Sysmon driver has an ioctl interface. We didn't find anything that would have obviously been exploitable, but we really just wanted to understand what ioctls were available and the context of how they were used. So there really aren't any extremely interesting attack scenarios here. There might be a few if you're already admin, but we didn't know going into it that we wouldn't find anything fruitful, but we needed to look anyway. And in order to get a handle to the driver, you need to have SE debug privilege. So the set of users and groups who can have SE debug privilege by default will be administrators, but we have seen scenarios where unprivileged users have been added via GPO to acquire SE debug privilege. So now we'll talk about configuration analysis. So I covered a generic evasion, specifically related to WMI, but we still want to take a holistic approach to evasion. So we're not going to have generic evasions for everything. If we did, that'd be great, but that is pretty unrealistic. But let's say that we were able to obtain a configuration. Our goal primarily would be to blend in with the noise. And Sysmon lends itself to having an attacker blend in really easily because in Sysmon you can define a bunch of include rules and then exclude rules. And it only takes a single exclude rule for you to completely evade that specific event type. So we're going to use Swift on Securities, canonical Sysmon config. Sorry, I'm not picking on you, but it's actually a really good configuration. But there are places where we might be able to blend in. So here's our evasion scenario where we possibly obtained the configuration, potentially without even needing to be admin. If the deployment scenario was such that we could obtain the XML on disk, we likely will already have access to that XML. Versus the binary configuration, which is locked down. Or if it was pushed via GPO, we wouldn't have direct access to the binary rules blob, but we would, as a domain user, be able to read that GPO. So this is our plan of attack. We're going to identify the attacker influenceable exclude rules and build a overall evasion strategy using those exclude rules. So here are the process create rules that I identified as being interesting. And the reason is one of the event conditions that I really like is the contains condition. And that's because I could have anywhere in my command line this thing that will be evaded. So if I have anywhere in my command line acro read 32 and that extra component, then I'll evade all process create rules. Same for file create time. We got another really good contains rule. So setup can be anywhere in the image path. Network connect. We have one is not quite as good, so the file name must be OneDrive.exe in order for us to evade network connections. And that's based on the image condition. Process terminate, there weren't any good evasion candidates, so we would have to fall back to like tradecraft avoidance. And one of the more obvious ones in this case was we'd want to avoid starting a process and terminating it within a path of C users. Now, driver loads aren't entirely relevant, like in our scenario where we may not even want to drop drivers, but there's still some evasion opportunities, assuming that we could load test-signed code. Now, create remote thread, I haven't tested this recently, but Casey posted a while ago that there is a generic evasion for create remote thread if you use the Q user APC API. File creates, there weren't really any ideal exclude rules, so we would have to resort to tradecraft avoidance. A registry event. So we can avoid all registry events if our path and file name ends with as follows. Now, the problem is, and we already have a generic evasion for WMI events. So the problem that we've run into is the following. Look at the third and the fourth conditions, where the file name would need to end with OneDrive and that path, including integrator.exe. So one would evade network connections, the other would avoid registry events. So what we would need to do to have a more holistic evasion would be as follows. So here's one instance of what avoiding or evading most of the rules would look like by combining those exclude rules together. So think about whether or not you would actually be able to detect that in your environment. And those of you who know PowerShell pretty well might be able to recognize that that is PowerShell running that evades most of these Sysmon rules.
So our conclusions about our analysis of Sysmon, again, we were just analyzing it from a data collector perspective. So from a tampering perspective, it's effective against non-administrators. That's kind of defined. Once you're an admin, all bets are lost. There are no guarantees about an attacker modifying or subverting Sysmon. From an attack surface analysis, Sysmon has a pretty small attack surface. There's a couple weaknesses that I showed with the privilege escalation opportunities, but overall easily fixable. In terms of evasion, rule enumeration is critical for an attacker in order to do this. Likewise, an attacker could take advantage of just really loud events that typically aren't analyzed. But analyzing that config file is super important for the attacker. In addition, the collection rules themselves leave us wanting. In specific, the exclude rules, because when there is an exclude rule, it is so easy to build an evasion using that. So if there was some way that we could build better collection rules to allow us to exclude stuff in a more targeted manner. Overall, Sysmon, it's great. It's a great additional data source for collecting events. But in order to actually use it, you need supplementary tools. To actually use it for detection purposes within an organization, you need several other tools in order to take advantage of it. So be that log forwarding, and as well as you need detection engineering. So once you have a SIM, actually manually building out those rules to detect attacker activity. Overall, in conclusion, attackers are going to continue to subvert endpoints no matter what. Vendors, we ask the question, are you doing subversion research on your products beyond just attack surface analysis and maybe tampering protection? Evasion resilience is a big gap area that we see in the industry, and we encourage others to focus efforts on that. Defenders, do you understand the threat model that your products protect against? And are you aware of how resilient they are to evasion underneath? So we encourage defenders to take this methodology and start applying it to their own products so they can get better insight into the efficacy of their products. Perfect. And thank you all very much. Again, we didn't wear this for nothing, so feel free to, we'd love it if you could donate to the Muscular Dystrophy Association. It means a lot to us. So.
Thank you. And we'll take questions in the breakout room.